Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. Welcome to this latest in a series of online video lessons intended to introduce you to the liberal art of rhetoric. When we started this series, we defined rhetoric the way that Aristotle does in his classic treatise on the subject. For Aristotle, rhetoric is an ability in each particular case to identify the available means of persuasion. This is an important definition to think about because Aristotle reminds us that rhetoric is not a paint-by-numbers art. We're never going to persuade audiences exactly the same way in different situations because every communication situation is unique. Whether we're engaged in political communication, making important announcements, informing the public, and justifying our responses to particular events. Or commercial communication, in which we want our audience to buy the product that we're selling, or to embrace a particular image of the brand that we represent. It could be a ceremonial or a ritual occasion in which we're honoring persons or events or ideas and the values they embody. Or it could be a popular opportunity to enact important social change by advocating for public policy. In these and so many other examples of rhetorical situations, communicators are faced with a number of variables that they're going to have to negotiate when they decide what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, and anticipating how the audience might respond. This is important not only if you're the persuasive communicator, but also for us as critical audience members to consider and evaluate the persuasive messages that we hear. One way we can think about the potential merit and success of a persuasive message is the extent to which it responds to the situation it's faced with. So in this video, we want to think about this core idea that Aristotle emphasizes for us, that rhetoric is situated. And because rhetoric is situated, context is crucial to understand how it works and how we can evaluate its success. So in this video, we're going to briefly define and explain what we mean by context, and then we want to dig into a 20th century rhetorical theory that has provided a simple but very useful means for understanding rhetorical context. Lloyd Bitzer's rhetorical situation. But first of all, what do we mean by context? Simply put, context is the conditional circumstances and elements that surround something and help us understand it. When we're talking about rhetorical communication, we want to remember that any message is going to take place at a particular time. We can think about the specific occasion or event. We can think about the broader historical moment that that occasion resides within. But it's not just about time, it's also about place or space. We can consider the specific setting of the message, the broader environment, whether we're considering environment geographically, ecologically, socially, politically. We can also think contextually about other material conditions that can have some sort of impact on the communication event, such as the composition of the audience or the available channels or media that the persuader has an opportunity to use. Finally, we can think about all of the social, cultural, and political conditions that precede a communication moment, that permeate it, and really have innumerable effects, not just on the communicator, but on the audience as well, and on the relationship between them. So given all of these myriad variables that we can think about regarding context, it can be a little overwhelming to think about. That's why the contribution of Lloyd F. Bitzer in his seminal 1968 article, The Rhetorical Situation, is so helpful. For Bitzer, communication takes place in specific, particular contexts and circumstances. So when we think about all of these variables, the environment, the setting, the audience, society, culture, all of these things, they define a specific situation. And for Bitzer, the situation is important because not only does it influence what's being said and how it's being said, but it actually provides the reason for the communication to take place in the first place. Bitzer understands rhetorical acts primarily as responses to situations. And so we can evaluate communication in terms of the communicator's goal. Whenever we try to persuade an audience, what we're ultimately trying to do, according to Bitzer, is to provide a fitting response to that situation. This idea from Bitzer is actually informed a great deal by Aristotelian rhetorical theory. The classical Greeks had two different senses of time. Chronos was clock time or calendar time, a way to measure time in a linear fashion. But kairos was opportunity time. We can think about it through the metaphor of a window of opportunity. If we find ourselves in a situation and we have a really good sense of the different variables that construct and comprise that situation, we can take advantage of the available resources in the available moment in order to communicate as effectively as possible. So Bitzer helps us realize that one of the ways that we can evaluate the success of a persuasive message is the extent to which it takes advantage of the kairotic moment and provides a fitting response to the situation. The rhetorical situation is that matrix of contextual elements that precede and surround a rhetorical act so that we can ultimately determine whether or not that rhetorical act provides a fitting response to it. So what a critic of rhetoric would do is to engage in some background contextual research in order to determine what are the various variables of context that comprise the situation. And here's where Bitzer's framework comes in. The first element of the rhetorical situation is exigence. Exigence can be basically understood as the rhetor's goal, defined by a problem which demands a response. Remember that rhetoric is goal-oriented communication. The reason for engaging in persuasive speech in the first place is to try to accomplish something. And so the rhetor needs to think about what those goals are. What are the problems that need solving? What are the challenges that need to be met? And the idea is if we engage in persuasive communication, we're going to be able to achieve those goals, to solve those problems or meet those challenges. And so determining the exigences is going to be the first major step of this kind of situational analysis. Once you have the exigences in mind, we have to start determining who is it that needs to be persuaded in order to address these exigencies. That's where the concept of audience comes into play. Now, generally, when we think about audience, the common definition is the group of people to whom a message is addressed. That's our basic dictionary definition, but Bitzer has something more specific in mind when you think about a rhetorical audience. For him, the rhetorical audience are hearers with the capacity and will to act on the exigencies. If I need to solve a problem or achieve a goal and someone needs to be persuaded in order to achieve it, I'm not just going to target my message to any random people. I want to try to find out which individuals and which groups of people are those that are directly capable of and potentially willing to help me solve my problem. Because it's going to be a persuasive success in reaching these audiences that's going to help me as the rhetor achieve my goal. And you'll notice the parentheses S at the end of audience because it's often the case that rhetorical messages are going to have multiple target audiences, sometimes attached to different exigences. To add to the complication, we need to think about the third element of the situation, and that is constraints. For Bitzer, constraints basically refers to contextual elements that limit the available options for persuasive communication. Depending on the surrounding contextual circumstances, you can't just say whatever you want, however you want, to whomever you want. The situation is going to make some kind of options impossible for you, some kind of options absolutely compulsory, and everything else somewhere on that continuum between good idea and bad idea. And so what you need to do is consider what are my best possible options given the limitations that I'm faced with. Now, of course, on the other hand, remember that contextual elements can also enable or make available windows of opportunity. And so we'll want to think about both of those aspects of constraints, first limits and challenges, and then opportunities. So in a nutshell, that's the rhetorical situation. Hopefully you can see at this point how Bitzer's theoretical formulation takes all of the complexities of rhetorical context and distills them into three broad categories of situational variables: exigences, audiences, and constraints that enable us to get a firm sense of what the situation is faced by a persuasive speaker. If we know what the problems or goals are that need to be addressed, the exigences, if we know the specific target individuals and groups that have the capacity and the will to act on those exigences, the audiences, and if we have a sense of the contextual limiting conditions that are both going to constrain and enable certain rhetorical options, we can ultimately make a more nuanced determination of whether or not a rhetorical act provided a fitting response to its situation. In the second half of this two-part series, we're going to hear a brief example of presidential rhetoric in response to a crisis situation. and consider how one might use contextual research to determine the specifics of the exigencies, audiences, and constraints that someone like a president would face when figuring out what to say and how to say it in response to this crisis situation. If you have any questions about the content of this video, please don't hesitate to leave a comment or to contact me directly. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.